is a special time.
Good evening. Welcome to Regent College. We are delighted to be together in this beautiful evening here in Vancouver, here in the West Coast. Welcome to all of you who are here with us in person. We are delighted to see you, seeing how beautiful we have this evening it is, and to see you here with us is really appreciated. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to all of you who join us online from anywhere around the world you may be. My name is Pablo. I am a student here at Regent and also this year's Evening Public Lecture Coordinator. If you have already subscribed to receive email updates, you know how relevant it is to be always up to date about everything that is happening here at Regent. Lectures, resources, events, everything that is happening. If you have not registered, we will invite you to register. All you have to do is to grab one of these little blue cards that are all the way back to the Buy the Donations box. And by doing so, on the blue side, there is a link that you can follow, and in that way you can register yourself digitally. The other option is on the white side, where you can enter your name and your email address, and we will register you from our end. Either way, this is the best way to be up to date about everything that is happening here at Regent. At this point, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, right now is the time to put it on silent mode. We will really appreciate it. We have a very interesting lecture tonight, and we would not like to be disrupted by any buzz or ring or ding. So please put it on silent mode. We will appreciate it. Lastly, those of you who join us in person, please be reminded that this event is being recorded and live streamed under the conditions spelled out in the public notice posted on the doors of Regent, both the doors of Regent and this chapel room. At this point, I would like to introduce Professor Dr. Jeff Greenman. He is our former president here at Regent and Professor of Theology and Ethics. He will be our host tonight. Professor Greenman.
Thanks very much, Pablo. Let me add my welcome, and it's great to see people here tonight. So my job is to tell you what we're going to do tonight and then introduce our speaker. So we'll follow the usual pattern. For some of you who have been to evening public lectures before, this will be a familiar format. I'll introduce our speaker, then we'll have around 50 or so minutes from him. Is that all right? Seem reasonable? And then it's time for questions and answers, or responses, discussion, dialogue with you all. So at the top of the stairs, for those of you who are here in person, there are microphones. That's where you'd go and ask a question. And for those of you who are online, you are able to send in your questions as well. Hello to those of you around the world on our live stream. It's questions@regent-college.edu. And I suppose if you're very, very shy sitting here in the room and you'd rather ask your question digitally, you could do that too. But we'd like to see you come up to the mic. So as you listen to the presentation tonight, be thinking about what you'd like to ask. So we'll have plenty of time together for discussion, and we will end by 9 o'clock tonight so you can all go outside and have ice cream and watch the sunset. Good ideas, huh? So on this beautiful evening, it's great that you're here. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. George Kalantzis. He is a friend and former colleague. We were together at Wheaton College in Illinois for many years. I was his boss for a while, and that was really fun. And so George is a theologian. He is an expert on the early church, and he's teaching a summer school course this week on the early church and early Christianity. That is one of his areas of focus and expertise and research and writing. He's the founding director of the Center for Early Christian Studies at Wheaton. And so he has an academic interest in theology, especially the early church fathers and mothers. Tonight, you'll be hearing from him in an area of also great interest and expertise, which has to do with immigration, migration, and refugees. He is a senior fellow of the International Association for Refugees and has been speaking and teaching around the world on the topic that he'll be speaking to us tonight about. He was just telling us at dinner he has a very extensive travel schedule related to these interests, taking him all over the world over the next months. He's the author and editor of many books. I only wanted to talk about one because he and I edited this one together, called Life in the Spirit, Spiritual Formation and Theological Perspective. Goes back to work that he and I did together in Illinois. Also, Bruce Hindmarsh, Gordon Fee, Susan Phillips, many other Regent people are in here as well. So a little testament. So a number of his books are out at the bookstore if you're interested. So with no further ado, join me in welcoming Dr. George Kalantzis.
Good evening. I see this is somewhat of a Baptist meeting. Everybody's sitting in the back. Nobody's sitting in the front. That's okay. It's a great delight to be with you. Yes, Jeff was my boss. It was fun for me. I don't know if it was fun for him. But we had wonderful time together. And it was actually under his leadership that I first started getting involved with, first with Christian response to disaster and disaster relief through the Humanitarian Disaster Institute that we have at Wheaton College, and later on with the International Association for Refugees. Tonight, I want us to think a little bit both about the numbers, but fundamentally about the experiences. One of the questions that we're going to ask is of language and how language forms identity. For example, as we're going along, is there a difference between using the term refugee and a person seeking refuge? Let that stay for a moment. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about numbers. The gray doesn't show up well, but let's assume the big square is the total number of migrants. Forcibly displaced persons is a smaller category of that, FDPs. Of those internally displaced persons, 62% of forcibly displaced persons is a smaller category of that. A third part is refugees, which is roughly about a third of forcibly displaced persons. And it is only 5% of those in the migratory journey who are asylum seekers. In our time, we confuse categories to our detriment and to the harm of people when we confuse who is in what category. We'll come back to that in a moment. In 2018, 2019, I was on sabbatical leave from teaching, which is a blessed experience to have, primarily because there are no committee meetings. But during that year, I had the opportunity to engage in research on the Greek response to the most recent, at that time, refugee crisis. Those of you who remember, in 2015 and 2016, there were two very heavy migratory movements that came through to Europe, primarily through Greece, many from Spain and Italy, but the majority came through Greece. 85% of the more than 1 million migrants who crossed the sea into Europe came through 2 islands in Greece, and from there to the mainland. My research concentrated on the response of local Christian communities, focusing primarily, but not exclusively, on the various experiences of the evangelical churches. At that time, to this time, the island of Lesbos, 4.1 miles from the Turkish border, still is, a primary node of entrance of refugees. Moria refugee camp was, at that time, the largest refugee camp and is contained within the Greek island of Lesbos, known since antiquity for its natural beauty and welcoming inhabitants. As we were getting ready to visit the camp in August of 2018, a BBC reporter produced a report and a short 14-minute film of her own recent, at that time, visit to the camp. The film described the conditions of one of the so-called hotspots of the refugee crisis for the then last few years. The title was, let me go back. The title was The Worst Refugee Camp on Earth. And it was made public in August. It was obvious that with a title like that, the government would respond. And the first response, of course, is a knee-jerk reaction, close access. I'm going to show us just a tad of that beginning and the end of that 14-minute video. You're welcome to go and find it. It's on BBC's website. If you just type BBC, the worst refugee camp on earth, it's going to show up.
The paradise island of Lesbos. Also home to the refugee camp described as the worst on the planet. We have rare access inside Moria camp. So we've been given 45 minutes only to go around the camp. It's horrifically overcrowded.
Please help us, please. For God's sake, help the women.
Plagued by constant fighting. Disease and trauma. Children as young as 10 attempting suicide.
Yes, it's not normal, but that's the problem.
I've got limited time to look inside Moria camp. Access to this place is controlled by the Greek government. And I have their press representative, George Matheou, as an escort.
Let's see if we can stop it for a moment and we'll come back to it. The camp in Moria was never meant to be what it had become. In order to reduce the number of people arriving into Europe from Turkey in March 2016, the European Union and Turkey reached a landmark agreement under which refugees seeking asylum in European territory through the Greek islands had been forbidden from entering what are called hotspot camps to travel to the mainland until their status had been established. So they're crossing from Turkey, they're housed in an island until their status is established. Does that make sense? That's the process. Established originally to provide contemporary housing from somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 people, by the time of the report, it was housing 9,000 refugees and asylum seekers from over 50 countries. It was never meant to be that. Conditions at the camp were so appalling that charities like Médecins Sans Frontières, Physicians, Doctors Without Borders, had actually left in protest. As Nye, the reporter, says, the place smells of raw sewage. There were about 70 people per toilet. The violence in the camp is extreme. In May of that year, hundreds of Kurdish people fled because of a huge battle largely between Arab and Kurdish men. In the report, Nye spends considerable amount of time listening to Luca Fontana, an epidemiologist and coordinator of Doctors Without Borders, who had previously worked in war refugee camps and Ebola outbreaks in Africa. He said, people, even if infected with Ebola, they still have the hope to survive or to support their families, their society, their village, their relatives. Here, there is no hope. Hope is taken away by the system. Now, what Jeff didn't tell you is that I was born and raised in Greece. I am Greek. That's why I'm speaking about the Greek example. This is not a condemnation of the government. This is about facts. This has nothing to do with the government. It has to do with the experience of those who seek refuge. Towards the end of the film, Nye sat down at the picnic table outside the camp with Ali, a Kurd from Afrin in Syria who fled his country because his home, like most of his city, was destroyed during the civil war that was still raging. Tyler, can we get to 7-11?
The Paradise Island of
Okay, don't worry about it. If it doesn't, this is Ali. Right next to him sits his daughter, 8 years old, 9 years old daughter, right next to him, listening to him speak. Next to Ali sat his young daughter, looking at her father as he narrated his journey. Ali spoke of the 3 years he and his family spent in Turkey as they tried to gather the money necessary to pay the smugglers for the sea journey across to Europe in Greece. He said, "When we first got to Moria, it was a very violent surprise." He said this matter of fact. "We found that there was already existing sectarianism and racism, whether it was between Sunni and Shia Muslims or Kurds, Arabs, and Afghans. To the surprise of no one who had ever worked in a war refugee camp, the conflict between rebel groups in Syria had also come into the camp in Europe. Whatever is the reason, the force that pushes people, displaces people from where they are, follows the migratory route. The conflict doesn't disappear because people move. So in the refugee camp, in the conditions of seeking refuge, people face the same conflicts." He continued, "The political problem that were happening in Syria also played out in Moria," he said. "The same problems, the YPG, Ghasad's al-Nusra, Free Syrian Army, the Daesh, ISIS, it moved here. And suddenly his affect changed. And that's the moment his affect changed. He's trying to contain his tears running down his cheeks, and he said, 'No matter what someone might say, if you don't live through it, you don't understand. It's like the war in Syria, but here it's uglier. What did you expect when you came here to Europe?' the reporter asks. Visibly beaten, he hesitated for a moment, but then he gave voice to the thousands who took the journey with him. 'For 3 years, I had trusted the sea would take me somewhere better. But the sea has betrayed me.' Refugee camps do not exist in a vacuum. In spite of the realities experienced by the refugees housed in Moria and the countless others in camps throughout the world, the experiences do not exist isolated. Humanitarian crises range from the Syrian war to the Botswana drought to the Venezuelan collapse, from the war in Ukraine to the devastation of the people group in Gaza. The numbers are staggering. In 2024, the UN estimated, this is the refugee highway. This is a map that is, before I go to the numbers we get lost in the numbers. But I want you to see visually, this is produced by the International Association for Refugees every year, and it's renewed every year per new data, UN data, at the end of the year. This map shows us the hotspots, and I know it's small and hard to read. I'll go to the numbers in a moment. But it shows us primarily where conflict happens and who receives those who flee the conflict. The numbers are staggering, as I said. The forcibly displaced persons population has increased from roughly about 42 million people in 2010 to close to 123 at the end of 24. In 15 years, it has tripled. The actual numbers, and you can see them here in a bit more chart, are even mind-boggling. In 2024, 1 in 67 people on Earth have been forcibly displaced. 1 in 67 have been forcibly displaced. UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency, estimates the number of forcibly displaced persons worldwide at the end of 2024 to exceed 123.2 million people. 42.7 of those are seeking refuge outside of their own home countries. This includes 5.9 million Palestinian refugees. Refugees, people seeking refuge, are those who need international protection because they were forced to flee their country of origin due to persecution, war, and/or violations of human rights. That is an increase of 7 million between January and December of 2024. That's a 6% increase in the span of a year. The number of displaced persons has increased every year for the last 13 years. 73% of the world's refugees are hosted by low and middle income countries. Iran hosts more refugees than any other country in the world, 3.5 million people. And if you have followed the news more recently, in the last month or so, Iran is expelling hundreds of thousands of Afghani refugees back, right? In 2024, 69% of forcibly displaced persons came from just 5 countries. 6.3 million from Venezuela, 6 million from Syria, 6 million, 5.9 from Palestine, 5.8 from Afghanistan, 5 million from Ukraine, 2.3 million from South Sudan, 2.1 million from Sudan. The UN reports that 30,000 people were uprooted every single day in 2024 alone, bringing the total number of newly displaced persons, as I said, to 7 million. Of the forcibly displaced persons, 8.6 million were newly internally displaced persons, bringing the total number of IDPs to almost 46 million, while 2.4 million were new refugees and asylum seekers. When one takes the numbers and plots them on a map, it truly seems as if the world is on fire. To this, one should add the 4.2 million stateless persons who are in an indefinite state of displacement without hope of redress. Stateless persons are not claimed, or they cannot claim any state as their own. Right? Imagine crossing the border and saying, "Where are your papers?" You say, "I don't have papers." "Where are you from?" It doesn't matter, they don't acknowledge me that I exist. 80% of the world's displaced persons are hosted by developing countries or territories affected by acute food insecurity, and malnutrition. Again, just thumb through the newspapers of the last couple of weeks. You'll see it. Children dying by the dozens, people are dying by the dozens of starvation. Hunger is a human-made condition. It doesn't need to exist. Factually, doesn't need. 48% of the world's refugees are women and girls. 50% of the world's refugees are under the age of 18. 8.4 million asylum applicants in 2024. Of the 8.4 million asylum applicants in 2024, only 188,000 were resettled in 26 countries. That is 8% of those identified by the United Nations as a critical need of resettlement. 8%. The average time for a refugee from selection to resettlement is 7.5 years. Leading places of resettlement include the United States, up to recently. The quota was, at the end of 2024, 105,500. Canada, with 49,300. Australia, with 17,200. And Germany, with 5,600. Like most of Europe, Greece was completely unprepared for the realities of the 2015-2017 wave. In 2015, of the 1,011,700 people who reached Europe across the Mediterranean, close to 860,000 came through Greece. The landmark figure, which was reached late on December 29th of that year, also indicated that 84% of those arriving in Europe came from the world's top 10 refugee-producing countries, fleeing war and persecution. Of those attempting the arduous journey into Europe by sea, almost 3,735 were missing, presumed dead, in the waters. For the period of 2015 to 2020, UNHCR calculates that the total number of those missing at sea was close to 20,000. In spite of its aspirations, policies on migration, immigration, etc., Greece, a country of roughly 10.5 million people, was not prepared for the reality. Since the mid-2000s, the country had faced chronic unemployment and economic stagnation, made famous by the crisis of that year. Oxford Analytica records that in the period between 2012 and 2017, the unemployment rate ranged from 21.5% to 27.5%. Imagine, in the depths of all that, having to welcome 900,000 new people in the period of a year. I will not bore you with, I can give you more numbers if you need to, and we can go through them. Suffice it to say that both state and non-state actors were overwhelmed, absolutely overwhelmed. In most of our discussions about displaced persons, our language, even in Christian circles, tend to veer towards legal descriptions and terminology, to describe persons as refugee, migrant, immigrant, asylum seeker, etc. That is understandable as we seek to engage each other clearly with identifiable terms across disciplines and legal systems. Yet, throughout the years, there has been another term that seems to me to be a far better descriptor, for it shifts the focus from status to person, from legal description for purposes of registration and accommodation to the real subject, and the term is survivor. What if we didn't talk about refugees, but we talked about 900,000 survivors? As one witness watches the face of Ali change from stoic recounting of a journey to a shattered reality of his family's experience, as one follows the quiet eyes of his daughter, listening to her father trying hard to maintain his dignity through the tears, survivor is the only descriptor that seems to capture the reality. These are not simply entries in a legal category and bureaucratic debates. Yes, those have their place. They're absolutely necessary so that we know who belongs where and how to respond to them. I'm a theologian. I speak as a Christian, not as an NGO. These are men and women. Gustavo Gutierrez, who died in the fall, the famous Peruvian theologian, has a famous interview with the BBC in which later in life he was interviewed about his work with the poor. If you know his work is with and for the poor all his life. And as he's there in that famous format of two chairs facing one another, and the interviewer starts, moving forward and talking to Gutierrez and says, I care for the poor. Like, I love the poor. I care for the poor. Gutierrez was like 5 feet on a good day, sitting on, standing on books. So it's a small stature man with a huge presence. So he leans forward in the chair, he looks the interviewer in the eyes and goes, I'm glad to hear you care for the poor. You really care for the poor? Yes, says the interviewer. That's great. What's their name? And he sits back. That's the theological response. Not the category. What's her name? What's his name? These are not simply entries in legal categories and bureaucratic debates. They're survivors of war and famine, extortion, exploitation, and rape. These are women and men who have endured. They have survived. Yet, in the process, they have also been dehumanized. They have become numbers. Attention has shifted from who they are to the legal status under which they can be categorized. Thus, the trauma of the circumstances that forced people from their homes, families, and communities is compounded daily. Study after study, example after example, reveals the stark reality that the number one fear among migrants of all categories is sexual abuse. The number one fear in migration and refugee work is not famine. It's sexual abuse. Those who work with survivors bear witness to that throughout the world. Whether during the journey from one's homeland or as they wait transport from one region to another, or even at a refugee camp and relocation center, sexual abuse and rape are common experiences affecting refugees of both sexes, of all ages, throughout the migratory journey. The International Association for Refugees has identified the continuum of trauma and recovery common in humanitarian disasters. There's a latter section that now we have been working on and has been added, and that is assimilation, entering into the city. But look at this graph. The continuum is, Tom Albison, the president of IAFR, has remarked often that, quote, when humanitarian disaster strikes, disaster response agencies need to rush in and stop the free fall for those directly affected by providing security, water, shelter, food, and medical care. That's standard disaster and post-disaster response. Think about the graph as we have it. To the far left is whatever the status quo is of the person, the community, the family, whatever they are. It can be high, it can be low. It is their life as they know it, right? The original short horizontal line represents the level of normalcy in which each situation or person is, and at the acute humanitarian event erupts. Then we have that red line going down sharply, quickly. That's the moment of emergency, right? That's where emergency response to the humanitarian disaster is usually most present, most needed. It is where big actors, from state actors to armies, big navies, big ships, aircraft carriers, stop the bleeding. Whatever it is that is happening, just stop it. People die, right? If you don't stop it, it goes straight down. And then we come into the period of stabilization. During this acute phase of the humanitarian disaster, persons are most traumatized and in need of assistance, dependent on outside agencies for survival. During that acute time, nobody cares if you're a banker or a farmer, a bus driver or university professor. Nobody cares about that. They care that you don't die, right? That's the point. Stop the bleeding. Survival is paramount during this phase, and all other elements of what we usually consider as contributing to one's well-being, such as personhood, humanity, whether intellectual, professional, artistic, relational, or even spiritual presence and identity, are pushed aside for the sake of survival. We have to make it to the end of the day. We have to make it through the night. This is also the most acute phase of dehumanizing. People lose their own agency and are most often completely dependent on the agency of others for survival. The third phase, or the second phase in the continuum, is that of stabilization. That's where refugee resettlement camps and other such expressions of post-event stabilization are usually the purview of non-state actors such as the UN, NGOs, etc. And even though some state actors may be involved in this phase, it is most often other relief and care organizations that work with the survivors for humanitarian disaster in the long term. And though that in the graph is a short period, for most people who have been forcibly displaced is a very long period. I'm going to talk in a bit about one of the biggest refugee camps in the world, Kakuma refugee camp in Turkana County in northwest Kenya, established in 1992 as a temporary place. It is currently over 300,000 people. What is evident during this phase, however, is that even though the basic level of stability may have been achieved, where security, water, shelter, food, and medicine, or medical care, have been established at one level, at another, survivors experience a deep sense of brokenness and of being dehumanized further, for they still have not regained agency. All too often, refugees find themselves viewed only as people in need. They're confined to the receiving end of humanitarian and social services that keep them alive. As Albinson notes, quote, a tiny fraction of the refugee population is given opportunity to integrate into their country of refuge or to resettle in another country in which they can begin to rebuild their lives. Most are going to languish in refugee camps, detention centers, government housing, or in the streets for years and even decades as they wait for a solution to their displacement. Life in such conditions is nothing short of dehumanizing, end quote. It is the practice in good faith of many of the receiving agencies to try to provide everything. Let me cook the food for you. Come and take food that I have prepared for you. Why? They didn't know how to cook back home? Like, let me build the shelter for you so that you can bring your family in. Do you see how dehumanizing that is? They didn't build homes back where they were? Let me bring teachers in to train your children. They didn't have teachers back home? Do you see the difference? It's out of good will, it's out of good intentions, but it's deeply dehumanizing because it takes the agency away. Survivors may be relatively safe, but they are still dependent on others. Doctors and engineers, teachers and bakers, bricklayers and lawyers, farmers and artists, spiritual leaders and pillars of their community have been flattened to the status of disempowered refugee, and they are treated as such. They may be safe, but they're far from recovered. Often they're far from being seen as human at the basic level. The last, is perhaps longest and most difficult phase in the continuum, is that of recovery and rehumanizing. At IAFR, we argue that this is where communities of faith have a central role. For no NGO or state agency can walk with the survivor through the process of one's own trauma with patience, care, affection, community, faith, as communities of faith can. No state program or humanitarian organization can reintroduce the sense of belonging, of being seen, of being recognized as human again, of having a name. Not in a holistic sense. I have a constant long-term fight with my Microsoft Word autocorrect. I type holistic with a W. It wants to start it with an H. I go, this is not about holes. Plug in, this is about holes. Microsoft says no. Holistic means no. Recovery work is about making people whole, not just plugging the hole in their need. Do you see? I will win at some point. I will have to figure out how to fix my autocorrect, but it's a struggle every time I type with it. In that sense, it is that this injustice, this structure of recovery, that communities of faith are uniquely situated to be places of long-term recovery. Christian churches and communities of faith who recognize every person as an image bearer of God have the unique responsibility in this continuum of recovery to assist in the long and arduous work of rehumanizing survivors and restoring hope by being places of safety and healing, strengthening community, faith, emotional well-being, and personal capacity. Christian communities ought to recognize their unique role to not be limited to relief and aid work akin to that of other NGOs, but rather to invest in the survivors' resilience and seek to strengthen their sense of personal worth and belonging as they worked to regain the sense of normalcy in life. And this begins with stories, the stories we tell. When we, in positions of power, tell the stories of migrants, how do we narrate them? Whose stories are they? To what end? Where I come from, I don't know if this is the habit in Canadian churches, but it is a long-standing habit for evangelical, for Protestant churches to send our youth to short-term missions, usually right across our southern border, to paint yet another wall that another team painted the week before. But okay. How do we train them to see? How do we train them, our young people, and therefore ourselves, to be hosted by rather than to come with power and money and affluence? Instead of doing for others, can we allow our children to have things done for them? To be hosted, to be guests, to surrender the power of their passport. Language matters. Stories matter. Stories that are innocent, stories are not innocent, they're system formative. We know this instinctively. We know it from experience. We know that language we use in the telling of our stories and those of others provides the structure of our experience, understanding, and perspective. Language shapes our humanity in the communities of discourses and practices in which we participate. Narratives are identity formative. As we narrate, language relates others to us and us to others. Through stories, we enter into the social and psychological transaction of power that forms us into the people we are and the people we wish to be. Because storytelling forms the teller, the hearer, and the very story itself, how we tell stories is equally important as which stories we choose to tell. In the classic, famous by now, I Saw Ramallah, Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti reminds us that stories also have the power to dispossess people. It is easy to blur the truth with a simple linguistic trick, he says. Start your story from secondly, and the world will be turned upside down. Start your story with secondly, and the arrows of the Red Indians are the original criminals, and the guns of the white men are entirely their victims. It is enough to start with secondly for the anger of the black man against the white to be barbarous. Start with secondly, and Gandhi becomes responsible for the tragedies of the British. Start the story of people of the migratory journey with a crossing of immigrants, migrants, asylum seekers, or refugees from Turkey into Europe. And we lose the war-torn cities, the collapsed apartment buildings that they've buried their tenants, the families, their histories. The wars that killed thousands, the generations oppressed, and war that disinherited the rest. Start with secondly, and they become powerless. Start with the powerlessness of the survivors and arms stretched for help to come out of a sinking dinghy. I'll get there. Sorry. No? Did I lose it? There's a famous story that Time magazine had of a boat landing into Lesbos with arms stretched in order to be received. Start with secondly, and we miss the beauty, the goodness, the eloquence, the artistry, the intellect, the capacity, the faith, the love, the hope that people bring with them. Start with secondly, and we'll lose our own culpability in the economic, political, religious, and social systems that have created and continue to contribute to the global nexus of oppression and exploitation, causing hunger, conflict, and disease, the manifest causes of displacement throughout the globe. Start with secondly, and we lose the fact that poverty and hunger are the result of our own choices, that neither is unavoidable, that both can be reversed and resolved in our lifetime. These are our choices. Start with secondly, and people become a single story. They're dispossessed. They become other. In the famous TED Talk, that's about 15 years old by now, Nigerian poet, writer and poet Chimamanda Adichie speaks of the danger of the single stories and the marks of power operative in them. She says, power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make that story the definite story of that person. The consequence of a single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we're different than how we're similar. Stories matter, she says. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. So what do we do? I want to propose that the gospel restores the dignity of people as image bearers of God. From beginning to end, that is the Christian story. Let us make human beings, male and female, let us make them in our own image, in our own likeness. Let us make them. Christian communities have the unique responsibility to reverse this othering, this dispossessing, to restore broken dignity and become the welcoming communities within which persons can move to a path of regaining the humanity that had been stripped from them. For the gospel to bear its social significance, however, it also requires the recognition of the narrative structure of Christian convictions for the life of the church. This means that Christian communities need to be continuously re-examining our own narratives, the stories we tell to ourselves about ourselves, and therefore about others, and therefore about God, God's good news. Christians recognize that the story begins with firstly, not secondly. The story does not begin in Genesis 3. And secondly, they sinned. That's not where the story begins. The story begins first. Let us make human beings in our own image. Let us begin by telling the story of the God who is love in 1 John 4:7, and the God who loves in John 3:16. But who loves not as a big teddy bear, right? This is how God loved the world. That's what that 4 stands for in John 3:16. For God so loved the world is not quantity. As I tell my grandson, this is how much I love you. I can see it in his eyes. Like, what about there? That's not what John says. John says, this is how God loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son. It's qualitative. And that love is the love of the God who loves. In the letters, God, how do we know what love is, he says. This is how we know what love is. That Christ died for us while we're yet God's enemies, sinners. Let us begin by telling the story of the God who creates human beings to be bearers of God's own image. These are indeed good news to the survivor, the dispossessed, to all who continue to be humanized by the power of the powerful. At the end, the aim of the Christian gospel, the good news, and that's why it's good news, is the gospel of shalom. But shalom is not just the cessation of war, the end of hostilities. Shalom is holistic. It's all-encompassing. Shalom is much more than the absence of violence. It's wholeness, completeness, balance, well-being, tranquility, prosperity, security, justice. Not any justice. It's God's justice, for which governments have been appointed. In Romans 13, government, Paul says, are not appointed for their own will to enact what comes to their head, whatever fancy whatever government at whatever time in whatever state exists, but to enact God's justice. It's the relational nature of God's interaction and intention for creation and human beings. The stories we tell also guide our actions and our understanding of why we behave in certain ways and not others. Stanley Hauerwas refers also to Christian communities, especially churches, and helps them to understand the difference between relief and other humanitarian organizations. Understanding the narrative structure of Christian convictions is what Stanley brings for us. Namely, the need to understand how we, Christian communities, different from relief and other humanitarian organizations. It is what I like to say the difference between etiology and teleology. And this is where we're going to conclude. Etiology and teleology, cause and purpose. I want to propose to us that the gospel makes it very clear that Christians do not feed the hungry and clothe the naked and house the houseless, the homeless, so that the hungry may be fed, the naked may be clothed, the homeless may have a home. That's what pagans do. Good-intentioned pagans do that. The reason why Christians feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and take care of the homeless is because that's what Christians do. It's causal. It's not teleological. We don't do it so that something else may happen. We do it because that's what Christians do. That's what it means to be Christian. So, that is the difference between Christian communities and others who engage in this work. In good, loving, kind, affectionate disposition. Atheists, everybody else, secularists and otherwise, can engage in the work of protection and care for those in need. But Christians have no choice but to do that. And every time we as Christians, as communities, either small or big, local or larger or national, we turn ourselves away from and our gaze from our brothers and sisters in need, those who bear the image of God, we betray the God who loved us this way, by dying for us. I know, I can hear it from the political theorist and the economic theorist. I can hear it in the background. How many can we afford? Really? 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 Actually, as a Christian, I have to ask the opposite question. Can we afford not to? Can I claim to come to the presence of the one who is and ask for forgiveness and life and care, and then come out of that and turn to the other and say, wait, somebody should tell a parable about this. I think a Galilean rabbi said something about this. Friends, we live in comfort. No, I don't mean, yes, that too. I live in the suburbs. I drive a minivan. But we live in the comfort of not knowing the name. What's their name? What's their story? Where do they come from? What are they like? And at the end of the story, you figure out, I know you. We don't share the same name, but I know your name and you know mine. Am I willing to give up my power and say welcome? And since we're here on the north side of North America, I want to say thank you to our Canadian siblings for taking the slack. Because when we closed our borders, you opened your borders. When we said next month we will have 0 asylum seekers and refugees entering, you said, we'll take them, and you did. And I can promise you, the world sees, the world pays attention. And the world also pays attention to us as Christians when with our words and our hymns and our prayers, we pray to the God of the universe, sovereign over all, who is Lord of all, who saved a wretch like me, and we turn to our neighbor and say, but not you. I want to close with this. I know I promised you that it was the closing, but I want to close with this. At the end of the day, love your neighbor, repeated twice in the Gospels, both in Matthew and Mark. Love your neighbor is not an idiosyncratic peculiarity for the few. It is a dominical command. The church is God's declaratory statement to the world of who God is, of what hope is, of what life without fear looks like. As James Smith has remarked, the church doesn't have an apologetic. The church is an apologetic. When the world asks, is there a God? God's first and only response is this: look at my people called by name, by my name, and you have your answer. When the world asks, can there be reconciliation? Is there such a thing as peace? God's only apologetic is, look at my people, called by my name. We, unfortunately, are in a habit of saying, and I don't know if he has reached north of the border, but south of the border, it's a common pious statement of my people. Don't look at me, I'm a sinner, I'm a wretched, look at Jesus. I don't know if it has reached you, but be careful because it's coming. Look at Jesus. What are we saying to the world? It didn't take with me, it may take with you, so try it out. What does Paul say? Do you want to know Christ? Look at whom? Me. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Love your neighbor is not an idiosyncrasy. It's a command. Why? Because that is what makes us like Jesus. Thank you.
I'm going to have you stand up for 60 seconds, stretch your limbs, shake a leg, turn around, do the hokey pokey, or whatever is necessary just for 60 seconds. Okay, folks, so if you have a question, we have 2 microphones here in the room. Feel free to go to one of those at the top of the stairs. If you're with us in the live stream, you want to ask a question, we'd love to hear from you. It's questions@regent-college.edu. Send them in. They come to Pablo, and he receives them. Time, lots of good things to talk about. George was saying he could talk about this for hours. So we won't do this for hours, but we have a good chunk of time for a good conversation. The gentleman up here at the top.
Hi there. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Kevin. I'm from Maple Ridge, but I live in Vancouver now. I have a question about the kind of the vision casting that you mentioned a couple of times throughout your talk in terms of things about famine being a man-made problem, and I agree. But I think that when we think of addressing situations such as famine or aid, or there's many other equivalent kind of analogous structures, that we can kind of go into 2 camps. And one camp might be, I need to stop the bleeding, but it's not up to me to stop the injury from happening in the first place. And then there are other potent moments in history, for example, the freedom movement or the civil rights movement in the United States, where the church has, or as citizens, as a part of a coalition, a group, et cetera, has attempted to address the overall situation that leads to the bleeding in the first place. And I guess one of the experiences that I've had, because, like you said, the world feels like it's on fire. I swear, there's a question, it's not just a comment. That the world is on fire, but there are certain eschatological beliefs relating to the end times that influence people's willingness to focus on the bleeding or focus on the original injury or who's holding the knife, I guess. Could you talk about how people have reconciled that, or any advice or just a response to that situation?
In less than 30 minutes. Okay.
Easy.
Easy. I don't think there's an either or. The place of the church is in the gap, whether that's pre, during, or after. The most profound, accidentally theological sign ever created is at the Tube in London, underground, right? Mind the gap. Have you remember that? Mind the gap. That's a theological statement. I know the train wants to use it differently, but that's the place of the Christian. The Christian is at the gap between oppressor and oppressed, whoever that oppressor is, whoever that oppressed is, before the conflict, during the conflict, after the conflict. Whether that oppression and oppressed is military or political or economic or racial or ethnic or gender or whatever it is, the place of the Christian is to be at the gap between oppressor and oppressed. Not only at the gap, if we are to follow Paul, in Christ there is no more Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female. Why? And I'm going to move book. Because Jesus, brought the dividing wall of hostility down through his own body. Jesus stood in the gap, not just between eternal life, life in heaven, and me going to hell. Jesus stood in the gap between the oppressor and us and said, no more. The problem is that Christians have learned historically, at least for the past almost 1,700 years now, to be in power. Since the advent of Christendom, we have learned to be in power. And we have not used power well. Because Christians are not created for power. We're created to be empowered by the one who has power, to stand against those who yearn for power. Can I use power many times in that sentence? But whichever way you end up that sentence, Christians do not belong at the center of power. So the place of the Christian is to preempt war. Jeff and I have had long-standing discussions on this in public. People say, so what do you do with the Second World War? I go, when? 1929 or 1939? Because these are two different discussions. Why do we have 1939? Because the church didn't stand against what was happening in 1929, right? Does that make sense? That's where the church is supposed to be. Can you imagine? Remember, I'm looking at the audience, some of you may not get the reference, but you remember the bracelets that we used to have back in the old day, WWJD, and if you were too pious, you had them on both wrists, remember those? I think it's about time that we bring them back, especially around voting time. Put them on your wrist and go to the ballot and say, what would Jesus do? See how the world changes. Can you imagine what could happen instead of sending millions of tons of armaments to war zones? 1 million Christians showed up at the border between Ukraine and Russia and said, you don't get to them but through us. But we're going to kill you. The early church had an answer to that. All martyrologists had the same answer. You can do what? We're going to kill you. That's it? That's all you got? Because we believe in the resurrection. Jesus will raise us. So you have nothing you can do to us. What if that was the attitude of the Christian? Not that we live in an economy of scarcity, but because we live in the resurrection, we actually not just utter it, but live it. In which the stranger is not an enemy anymore, but a welcomed guest. Why? Because I'm not afraid. What can you do to me that Christ's resurrection does not address? We confess, but often we do not believe. So people suffer. I'm sorry, I revert into sermon rather than answer. But that's my, The place of the Christian is both before the conflict, during the conflict, after the conflict, on the side of the oppressed. That's the bottom line. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Let's go up here, top of the stairs.
Yes, hello, thank you so much. It was a heavy but a delightful talk. I wanted to ask about the way that Scripture is used in the healing process, that long green line. And what immediately came to my mind when we started talking about migrants, refugees, survivors, was the exile. And the way that God is reimagined after and throughout the process of exile. And I find it really interesting that Palestinians have often used the language of exile and diaspora to describe their own experience. So I'm curious, how can the church incorporate exile and the Old Testament experience of exile into the healing process of telling a new story for those who have lost their homeland in
Thank you.
some way?
Thank you. That's a great question. It always surprises people who come from countries of power when they come in refugee camps, or in other parts of the world that are not as powerful as we are, affluent as we are, that the vast majority of sermons do not come from the New Testament. Hagar is a common sermon story. The exile stories and narratives, the prophets, are common, far more common than Paul. You may talk about Paul here and there, but where the people without power find themselves is in the stories of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures. Why? Augusto Gonzalez, in his brilliant book, Mañana, Theology from a Hispanic Perspective, I think it's about 30 years old by now, mid-80s it was written, has a section in 2 paragraphs, beautiful paragraphs. He talks about history. He calls innocent history and responsible remembrance. And the example he gives in innocent history, and I'm to the, where are you? To the exile, he gives the exchange that Jesus has with those in Judea around him when Jesus says, know the truth and the truth will set you free. Remember that? Remember the response? Free? We're children of Abraham. We have never been slaves to anyone. And you go, I'm sorry, what? So, Egypt, Syria, Assyria, Babylon, the Greeks, Syria, and look around, the Romans. So when exactly have you been free? He calls that innocent history. Not naive, but innocent. It's this history, the telling of the story that tries to support and sustain the status quo. Contrary to that is responsible remembrance. And that's why the stories of Exodus come, the stories of the prophets, which are not just the stories of old, they're our story. The story into which we were grafted as the people who were grafted into the story of God. I'm Greek. Most of you are just what Scripture calls barbarians. But okay, I'll give you whatever. But we are grafted into those stories. These are not foreign stories to us. The story of Exodus is God's faithfulness to the people of God, including us. But responsible remembrance, he says, has to lead to responsible action. You've got to remember, he says, that the prescriptions of God, you will treat the sojourner with kindness and acceptance. Why? Because you were sojourners in the desert. You will not sell the land in perpetuity. Why? Because it belongs to me. Do you see the consequence? Responsible remembrance leads to responsible action. We like our stories without a demand, because the demand of the responsible storytelling changes my life. And I like my suburb. I like my minivan. I like driving an SUV and paying $2 for gas. A gallon, not a liter. Where's that going to come from? Who's going to protect my interests, if not the armies? You see how that works? And fundamentally, we have created a world, because marketeers and politicians have created for us, of dipoles and polarities. I don't have to be anti-Semitic. I am not, in order to raise the plight of the Palestinians and say, this is wrong. It doesn't excuse anything else to claim this is wrong. Does that make sense? I can love both people equally and recognize the evil perpetuated by all. But it's going to cost me. As a community, as a government, as a people. What would happen if 1 million Christians showed up in Gaza today? Just for fun. What do you think would happen? Would the convoys go through? If 10 of us show up, no, nobody cares. Get out. What about 1 million of us? Wouldn't that be fun? Just bringing it out there, just saying.
We'll join you there. Yep. Question up here.
Maybe you've already ventured into my answer, but Canada's federal government has recently proposed Bill C-2, which limits and diminishes the rights of refugees in Canada. In part, it's a response to the trade negotiations with the U.S. And it raises the question of what are specific prophetic responses the church needs to make in light of North American closing the doors towards refugees.
We're live, right?
Yep.
Give me a second to rephrase what I was about to say.
You want to still go home on Sunday, right?
Look at the time. What if churches, actual physical churches, church buildings, congregations, communities said, our church is a sanctuary. For how long? As long as it takes. Our kitchen is open to everyone. Our lower level, our basement, our sanctuary, whatever it is, we'll put cots in and we'll stand outside. You don't get in but through us. Would it stop? I don't know. Let's try it. I don't want to be apocalyptic. I really don't. I don't think we're that far off from masked agents coming into homes and churches trying to pull people out. I really don't. If you ever wondered what would you have done in 1936, you know. It's right here. I really don't. Remember that at least for now, every 2 or 4 years, I don't know how often you do it, you go to a ballot box. We all have a tendency to blame the government, right? Them people in the government. Who put them in government? Like we did, right? So, right? Would you protect somebody who's fleeing from a war zone with your own liberty or freedom? If you don't now, guess what you would have done in 1936? It's not that complicated. So what about civil disobedience? Civil disobedience has always been not a last resort, but one of the very, very, very first acts of Christians. It's that fundamental no. Not in my name, not in the name of God, not for me. That's fundamental civil disobedience. We have a long history as Christians of civil disobedience. But civil disobedience comes with consequence. Am I willing to be arrested? Am I willing to pay more taxes? Am I willing to whatever it is that, am I willing? Again, I like my lawn. I like my minivan. I like my $2 a gallon gas, which we haven't seen like in years in the US, but okay, we'll stay with that. What are you willing to give up when the government says what it says? I don't know. Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for this excellent topic. You may have already addressed my question in part, but I kind of have a two-part question. In the church, we tend to play it safe, in my experience, as a lifetime member going to churches. We tend to pray. If there's a world problem or a situation, we tend to pray for it. But many people have said, and you reference to it, it's not Jesus, it's me. Or Jesus doesn't have anything except my hands and my feet. So that's one question. And the other part of my question is, there's been a lot of research done about if this is about protesting and public peaceful public display of displeasure with the policies, that if you can get out 3.5% of a population, you're going to affect change. I know organizations in Vancouver, Palestinian supported, they're begging for people to come out for protests. They can't get people to come out. So my question to you is, from your perspective, where have we as churches failed in teaching that kind of practical display of our faith? We tend to, my experience is we tend to play it safe. How can we address that in our churches to get people to take ownership of what's happening in our world?
Thank you. We have lost, I'll start with the second one and go to the first. We have lost the social significance of the gospel. When Jesus says, or when the gospel says, the New Testament says, in Christ, there is no Jew and Gentile, that has consequence. We don't actually believe that. We don't practice this. Our practice shows our faith, right? We don't believe that. The good news has been minimized, titrated down to my soul going to heaven. And the rest of this goes to hell. That's not the story of God. Behold, I am making all things new right now. So we haven't learned to see that. We haven't learned to see the joy of being with somebody you don't know. With Tom, we go to Tom Albinson, the president of IAFR. We go to Kakuma refugee camp, and Tom, I've said this before, so he knows it if he watches this, has a very bad habit. Though I'm an academic and I speak for a living, I'm an introvert. Like I'm a, what do they call this? An introverted extrovert, or an extroverted introvert, one of those two. So I would rather walk and notice with my eyes. Tom has a very bad habit, like insanely bad habit. That is, he knocks on doors. Like, I cannot do that. Like, I'm Greek, we don't do that stuff. So he would walk around the camp and knock on door. Like, somebody invariably would answer and says, hi, my name is Tom. Can I pray for you in the name of Jesus? And like, I'm trying to get into the bush in the back, like just disappear in all this. It took me a while to be comfortable with this. In the years, we have almost 10 years, more than 10 years we've been doing this. Not a single time has anyone said no. Not once. Not a single time. Majority Muslim and other, right? Not once. The gospel has social significance. The joy in the despair. When I go to camps, I never take pictures of toilets and sad people with none of that. Because there's joy, there's laughter, there's music, there's beauty, right? Because that's the image of God. What have we done? We have made the gospel for me and my salvation, rather than that reconciliation, that reconciling in God's own image, new community of Greek and Jew, male, female, slave, free. The dividing wall that Jesus broke down, we keep on rebuilding it. Brick by brick, line by line, row by row. Because it gives us safety. To your first question, I love Pope Francis of late memory. You pray for the poor, and then you feed the poor. That's how prayer works. Or Gutierrez, in his famous book with Paul Farmer, Walking with the Poor, he gave a talk at Notre Dame in 2011. It was included in the book. He goes, how can we be for the poor and not be at the same time against the system that makes them poor? How can I speak for the poor and not against the system of their poverty? Because at the end, poverty is about death. Places of poverty have lower life expectancy, higher health inequalities. Poverty is not just pecuniary. Poverty is deadly. You pray for the poor, and then you feed the poor.
We'll make this our last question up here at the top.
It's a little odd to say, I wonder if what we're hearing is perhaps a little too simplified, in that when we look at the refugee problem worldwide, or shall we say, the problem of immigration to Canada and the US, which is what we're living with right now. The discussion is neglecting at least one fact that is rather significant, and that is some of that immigration, particularly in the US, has been a forced immigration of the poor or perhaps even criminals. This is creating a problem of discernment that was not touched on.
Yeah.
We also have the problem that the numbers coming in are presenting a problem to the safety net of the governments, let alone the churches, in that the governments have responsibilities assigned to them by the people of the country, and they have a finite amount of resources that's there, and an unrestrained amount of immigration will stretch these systems to the breaking point. There are cases in the US where certain hospitals have first been forced to close their emergency departments, and in some cases close entirely. So I am wondering, and the sentence that brought this into high relief was when it was said, we should have the bracelets of what would Jesus do, and when we go to the voting booth and vote. And I suspect that some of my neighbors to the south already have those bracelets and voted in a way for perhaps even closing or minimizing illegal immigration when both parties are in favor of the standard legal immigration and the standard exemptions for refugees and asylum seekers. So I'd like to say this has been totally helpful, and it does focus, has taught me some things I did not know, and I'm grateful for that. But I wish I could get away from the feeling that there's been a little bit too much simplification here.
Yeah. Well, in an hour's lecture worth of discussion, thank you for that question. Thank you. And you're right. Resources is something we always need to think through. But let me ask you this. Is the Christian faith based on an economy of scarcity or an economy of abundance? Fundamentally, for Christians, we live in an economy of manna, right? What will we eat tomorrow? Give us this day our bread for today. And yet the economic system and structure system and cultural system out of which we operate says, yeah, but what about my 401k or my pension or my 20 years down the road? My safety then? Who guarantees you're going to wake up tomorrow? So I hear that. I make a distinction between, of course, migration and refugees. And we have to. As I said, on average, a refugee is resettled after 7.5 years, not of waiting, but of being processed through the most processed, checked, safety, security, TSA, CIA, FBI, like every acronym you want, they have gone through, right? With the last year of before relocation being health checks. These are the most vetted people on earth, right? Refugees, resettled refugees. There is no one who is more vetted. None of you, none of us has been vetted as much as these people have, right? And there is the huge narrative, at least south of the border where I am, of criminals coming in, right? I know of a woman, I know her, she's not a friend, I just know of her. Venezuelan, now single parent, her husband stayed back, was killed, who when her daughters, 2 daughters were 6 and 9, the neighborhood in which she lived, it was a middle-class neighborhood. She was a professional. The neighborhood was taken over by a gang, and the gang said, your daughters will work for us now. So in the middle of the night, she left her middle-class apartment, grabbed the 2 girls, and walked all the way up through the Darien Pass, through the Rio Grande, finding her way to Chicago, where she worked as a cleaner in a hospital for 10 years. Her daughters went to school for 10 years. The oldest one was about to enter university when, in a school pickup, she was apprehended and deported. She a criminal? Well, she came without legal process right into the U.S.
Excuse me, can I make one final?
Yes, please.
When I said criminals, I am referring to people who have either committed criminal acts
Right.
in the States or criminal acts elsewhere and are known. I think the number is something over 1 million, the figures I've heard.
Yeah, I would double check those. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Which is a misdemeanor. It's not even criminal, right? It's at least in American experience, it's a misdemeanor. Crossing the border without papers? It's the second time that you cross the border that becomes a criminal offense. Yeah. What I'm telling you is that the first offense, when one is arrested, they're arrested under a misdemeanor. The second time, it becomes a felony. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So let me just suggest this. Yeah, I hear you. Let me suggest this. I would invite us to double check the numbers, because we just went through a presidential election year where all sorts of numbers were tossed around, right? Can you imagine 1 million criminals, like hardcore criminals, gang members, etc., roaming around in the US? Oh, that's
I think, George, we need to wrap up because we're kind of over time now.
But that's where I would go to reputable sources to see the numbers. Actually see the numbers and not the heightened agendas of political times. But at the bottom line, as a Christian, is my response to somebody who is a gang member different than somebody who is not? I'm not speaking for the state, I'm speaking as a Christian. My response is absolutely not. Because if I cannot see the face of Jesus, the image of God, in the face of a drug dealer, I cannot see the image of God in the face of his victim. Thank you.
So just a couple of quick notices from me, and we'll be on our way. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your questions. If you've enjoyed tonight's lecture and you are so inclined, I'd invite you to make a donation in our donation box back there. That helps support summer school and puts things like these evening public lectures into play for all of us to enjoy. Thank you for joining us online as well. I'm here to tell you that this evening's lecture has been recorded. If you want to let someone know or look at it again, it's on our YouTube channel. Well, until the end of August, all of the lectures from our summer school evening public lecture series are there until the end of August. Speaking of which, the next one and the last one of summer school is on Wednesday by Susan Phillips, who has spoken many, many times here in this chapel. The topic, Enlarged Imagination, Reflections from a Life Listening to Others. There's also chapel tomorrow if you happen to be here at 11:45. Let's thank George again for a very stimulating evening.
Thank you.